Well, good evening. Welcome to our Friday night Bible study. We're glad you could be with us, and we hope we have something uplifting to share with you this evening. It has been a week, kind of an interesting week, and we're talking about right here at this house. We had an event, and I couldn't hear you. You didn't come through.
When's the exterminator coming?
After we're done here, that's the plan.
Right.
Um, So the two of us are recovering from withdrawal, specifically internet withdrawal. We were having problems starting sometime Tuesday when we had some weather blow through with our internet connection conking out on us for 10, 15, 20 minutes at a time, and sometimes for more than an hour. And for retired people who spend all their time at home, not having internet can be uh, a little bit, well, what do you do? Uh,
And we look at each other and talk to each other and
well, yeah, but at any rate, yesterday morning early, and by early I mean probably around 7 o'clock, I heard something that sounded like thunder. And I'm not certain if it's linked, but we weren't having a thunderstorm, I discovered. At any rate, uh, discovered that our internet was out. Well, I had been out the day before and looked at the connection on the outside wall of the house. We have cable internet by the local cable TV provider. So they run a coaxial cable from the phone pole across the street over the street to another pole by our house, and then from there to the side of our house. And I was checking because it comes down to a box on the wall, and then we have our cable coming out of that, and sometimes that cable has problems. So I was just checking to make sure. And in fact, to make sure that I didn't have a problem with the wiring associated with our house, I actually disconnected that wire, took our cable modem outside. There's an electrical outlet near where all this is hooked up on the side of the house, and plugged it in and hooked it up, and it did not connect to the internet even out there. So I'm saying, okay, we're having problems at this box. I took it back in the house, I hooked it up, and like 5 minutes or so later, we had internet again. This was during the day, Wednesday. Well, yesterday, I was laying down and was sort of asleep when I heard that noise. Didn't really know what it was. Got up later, noticed that we didn't have anything, and was wondering when that was going to fix itself. And then we got a knock on the door. So I went and answered the door, and our next door neighbor was standing there. And he said, "You have a wire down on your beside your house." So I followed him around. I actually went outside barefoot. I followed him around to the other side of the house because I didn't know what wire might have come down. I was pretty sure it wasn't the electric wire because the power was on. We didn't have any problems with that. Got around there and I saw our internet cable hanging over the phone wires that it came in next to, and the box that had been attached to the wall had been yanked off the wall and was hanging up in the air, dangling by these cables. And I got to looking around, and the force that caused this wire to fall had been so strong that it had actually yanked cable out from under the house, and it had snatched the ground connection. There's a ground pole out there that my electrical and the phone company stuff and the cable company stuff all connects to. It's a pole that's actually driven into the ground. It's supposed to be driven in 10 feet. I'm not sure how far it was, but it's pretty deep. That got yanked around, so it was sticking out beside the air conditioner instead of being leaned up against the house like it was supposed to be. And then the ground wire inside the box came loose, and the box got dragged even farther out. So I thought, well, maybe there's still a connection. So I didn't undo anything inside the box, but I did come in, and our phones normally use Wi-Fi calling, which means that the Wi-Fi has to be connected to the internet. So our phones were going to have, if I was going to call out and report this, I was going to have to be able to get the cellular signal instead of using Wi-Fi like we normally do. Which also meant that I was going to have to use my phone to get on the internet to look up the number. I don't get a paper bill from my internet provider. It's sent to me by email. I called them. They took me through their automated attendant routine, and at some point they wanted my 4-digit access code. I gave them a code that I thought it might be. They said, that doesn't match my records. Your code will be found at the top of your bill. Well, that's great. I don't get a paper bill. I don't have internet right now, so I can't look up and see if I can find my bill on the internet, which I've never seen it because I just pay it online, and it doesn't actually display the bill. It just tells me what I owe. So I don't know that I've ever seen this number. Well, it eventually gave up and got me with a human being. I was able to tell him, I've got a wire down. And while I was talking to this person, I actually traced the wire across the neighbor's yard and down in front of the neighbor's house beyond that. And then I discovered that it had actually come loose at the other end. It was just laying there on the ground, so it no longer crossed the street. I'm guessing that for it to have enough force to do all the damage that it did, including breaking that plastic box to pull it off the wall, because bits of plastic were still attached to the screws that had held that box to the wall, that there had to be a lot of force. And the only thing I can imagine is that somehow a vehicle going down the street snagged that cable and yanked it down. Now that makes me think that it was already sagging in order for a vehicle to have caught it and snagged it and yanked it. But that would explain. And it actually yanked a lag screw that's about that long out of the pole. I think probably, given on where it was on the cable, the pole out in front of our house. It actually yanked that clear out of the wooden pole, and it was just dangling there, hanging from the cable, because I eventually pulled it all up and took it apart so that when the technician got here, he just picked it up and put it in his vehicle as trash along with some of the other stuff that I'd picked up. But they were able to send a technician yesterday, and we got our internet back around 5:30 or so, I would guess, before dark, because the guy was able to pull the cable clear across the street, get everything hooked back up, and have us on before the day was over. So that was the big event at our house this week. The other thing that I just discovered recently, and this is something that happened yesterday, the SpaceX company, that's the one owned by Elon Musk, attempted another launch and had another rocket blow up. This was sometime yesterday. And the rocket blew up and scattered debris over a wide area of the Caribbean. and they actually had to warn air traffic away from the area for a period of time. So a lot of flights were delayed and put into holding patterns and all this because of this explosion. SpaceX's launch facility, if you don't know, is located in Texas, in South Texas. In fact, so far South Texas on the Gulf Coast that it's only a few miles north of Mexico. It's essentially, I forget the name of Boca Chico, I think it is, which is just east of Brownsville, Texas. In fact, some of the places near there have Brownsville addresses. So that's an event that happened this week. Another thing that I want to get into before we actually begin tonight's study, and that involves last week's sermon presentation. Kind of ran out of time and room as I prepared it, and I got to thinking during the week that we really didn't do a very good job of explaining what we believed and didn't believe about what happened in the incident. And for those of you who perhaps don't pay any attention to our sermon presentations, we did a presentation about the story of Jewish King Hezekiah, whose story is repeated 3 times in the Old Testament. Once in the book of Kings, once in Isaiah's book, and once in the books of Chronicles. So it gets a lot of biblical attention. And the story that we looked at, we only looked at the first of several stories about it, and that's the one about the threat of Sennacherib and how Hezekiah ended up being delivered from the threat of the Assyrian ruler. And there is, I decided, a possibility that, based on the way we wrote that some people might think that we have taken the viewpoint of some German theologians that God uses Satan as his executioner. What we had said was that when the Hebrew writers said that the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 Assyrian soldiers, that we didn't believe that an agent of God would do that. That sounds like the work of a destroyer. And if there was an angel involved, then that would have to be the angel, the destroying angel, known in the book of Revelation as the destroyer, as opposed to the creator. And we suggested that it's possible that God, in response to the arrogance of the Assyrians, lifted his protection, and then Satan, no longer bound by God's limitations, as it says in the book of Job, and it says this of the sea, but the sea in ancient Near East thinking was this mysterious place, and it was a good representative of the forces that oppose humanity. And in fact, later in the book of Job, reference is made to Leviathan, the ancient beast out of the sea. And we read that also as a reference to Satan. So when it says in Job that God said to the sea, hitherto shalt thou, and I'm using King James because that's what I memorized so many years ago, hitherto shalt thou go and no further, and here shall thy proud waves be stayed. I see that today as expressing God's limitations on what Satan can do. Even Satan has a certain amount of freedom, but God has set boundaries on him. And should God lift those boundaries, then Satan does what is in his nature, which, as we suggested, he is a murderer from the beginning and a liar and the father of lies. So he just acts on his nature and people die. But we don't want people to think that we believe that God uses Satan as his executioner. That's not the case. God's wrath is to give up. We've discussed this from time to time as we go through the Bible, that he lets go and he lets us have what we want if we continue to stubbornly resist the Spirit. But we also know that God does not want anyone to perish. And the reference for that is in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 9. Let me read it from the NIV. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. He is patient with you, not wanting anyone to perish, but everyone to come to repentance. So it is never God's will for someone to perish. Now, we want to make it clear here that Peter may well have used the term perish not in reference to the first death, but actually in reference to the second death, as seems to be indicated by his alternative, all to come to repentance. Repentance does not deliver you from the first death. It delivers you from the second death. But still, we believe God does not delight in human death. He never issues kill orders. So then what happened to those 185,000 Assyrian soldiers? Well, as we suggested, and this is just a possibility, God loosened his restrictions on Satan, and then what happened was just a natural result. I would like also to address the idea that the arrogance of a few people who were the Assyrian leaders would lead God to kill 185,000 soldiers, some of whom may not have shared in it. Well, there's no indication that the 185,000 was all the soldiers involved. So it could be that the protection was removed only from those who shared in their commander's arrogance. Just some possibilities there. And it's always possible that the deaths had nothing to do with God or with Satan, but were a result of something else. Even with Sennacherib's arrogance. But it's recorded the way it is because the Jews saw it that way, because those deaths led to their deliverance from the siege of Sennacherib. So, just a few things that we wanted to look at and think about. So we are prepared now to get back into the book of 2 Samuel, and let's bow our heads before we formally begin. Our Father in heaven, we thank you for your blessings, for getting us through another week, and for helping us to cope with all the difficulties that we have, many of us, encountered. As we take a little time to open the written word, we want to receive a proper blessing and a proper understanding of you and your character. So we ask that you will send your Holy Spirit, who can reflect your character in our hearts as we read. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
I apologize.
Yeah. So let's switch over here so that you can see our app and can read along with us. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 9. Last week we read the story of bringing the ark to Jerusalem. We read about how Michal, Saul's daughter, saw David arriving at Jerusalem, not wearing his royal robes, dancing and celebrating, and she despised him because she thought it was important for royal people to keep their status symbol clothes on them at all times, to be held in honor. And David's like, it doesn't matter how I dress, I'm still held in honor because the people like who I am, not what I look like. So now we reached the thing that we covered in a sermon presentation several months ago in chapter 9 of 2 Samuel. One day David asked, is anyone in Saul's family still alive? Anyone to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? He summoned a man named Ziba, who had been one of Saul's servants. Are you Ziba? The king asked. Yes, sir, I am, Ziba replied. The king then asked him, is anyone still alive from Saul's family? If so, I want to show God's kindness to them. Now recall that 3 of Saul's sons died in that final battle with the Philistines, and that another remaining son of Saul was assassinated by a couple of scoundrels who thought they could do David a favor by killing his rival, and it ended up David ordered their execution over it. So now David wants to know, is there anybody left? So he calls in this servant of Saul's family and asks him, anybody left alive? I want to show kindness to them, God's kindness to them. Ziba replied, yes, one of Jonathan's sons is still alive. He is crippled in both feet. Now, this is the Mephibosheth that we read about earlier. When we got into 2 Samuel, early in the narrative of the results of the battle, we read that one of Jonathan's sons was only 5 years old, and his nursemaid grabbed him and fled when she heard the news of the defeat of Israel's army by the Philistines. And as she was fleeing, she dropped the infant, and the fall injured the lad's legs, and not having the kind of medical care we have today, ended up crippled in both feet as a result of this. Reading on, verse 4. Where is he? The king asked. In Lodebar, Ziba told him, at the home of Machir, son of Ammiel. So David sent for him and brought him from Machir's home. His name was Mephibosheth. He was Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. Now there's a footnote there for that name. Mephibosheth is another name for Merib-Baal. When he, that is Mephibosheth, came to David, he bowed low to the ground in deep respect. David said, Greetings, Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth replied, I am your servant. Don't be afraid, David said. I intend to show kindness to you because of my promise to your father, Jonathan. Now, we don't know what time this is. If Mephibosheth was only 5 when he died, and if David reigned for 40 years, Mephibosheth was only 45 when David died. So, given the placement of this in the story, it is after David's stay in Hebron, which we read was about 7.5 years. So, or was it 6.5? I think it was 6.5 years. At any rate, it's after that. So, at that point, he's about 11. We have a little more time to pass for David to get the ark moved, because this probably happened after that. But Mephibosheth could well still have been a teenager at this time, maybe even in his early teens. And at this point, since the last time he saw his father was when he was 5, he may not remember Dad all that well. But at any rate, David says to him, I will give you all the property that once belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will eat here with me at the king's table. Mephibosheth bowed respectfully and exclaimed, Who is your servant that you should show such kindness to a dead dog like me? This is perhaps extreme self-deprecation on Mephibosheth's part, and some of that may have been just how people believed they needed to relate to a king. The king held in those days absolute power. If he wanted you dead, as we've already seen, he could give an order to his men and you'd be summarily killed. You wouldn't get a last meal. It happened when the king said for it to happen. So you needed to treat royalty with due respect. And so the culture may have been to overdo it a little bit, as we see happening here. And recall that for the Hebrew people, the term dog was a term of total contempt and disrespect. And he's calling himself not only a dog, but a dead dog. When we get to Ecclesiastes, we'll see something that Solomon said. A living dog is better than a dead lion. Again, drawing on that concept that for the Hebrew people and even for people in the ancient Near East, the term dog was intended to show extreme disrespect. It was an insult and a slur. And so he's using that term and he's making it dead dog to further empower the disrespect intended by these words in an act of extreme self-deprecation. And David doesn't even respond to it. At least if he did, it's not recorded for us. They just record that's what he said and then goes on to say what happened next. Then the king summoned Saul's servant Ziba and said, I have given your master's grandson everything that belonged to Saul and his family. You and your sons and servants are to farm the land for him to produce food for your master's household. That means everybody who belongs to Mephibosheth. But Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, will eat here at my table. And then in parentheses it notes that Ziba had 15 sons and 20 servants. And there's a footnote there for household, and that tells us that that's as in the Greek version. The Hebrew just reads, your master's grandson. If, as I just suggested, he's still in his early teens, he probably didn't yet have a family. And if he's crippled in both feet, who knows if he ever did? That's not told to us. We don't have any reference to know that. At least I don't think we do. I'm not recalling right now. I've read anything about Mephibosheth having any sons. So he may have married, he may not have. He may have had sons, he may not have. Mephibosheth, okay, I'm wrong. Boy, I got to yakking too soon. Mephibosheth had a young son named Micah. From then on, all the members of Ziba's household were Mephibosheth's servants. And Mephibosheth, who was crippled in both feet, lived in Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's tables. I just made a fool of myself, didn't I? Because it says right here, He did have a young son. But,
That doesn't mean he got married.
huh?
That doesn't mean he got married.
Well, I don't know what the culture was about that in those days. Pretty much, I don't think. Yeah, there may have been a certain common law system. You were just assumed to be married to a woman if you had children by her. And if he had a son, we know there had to be a woman involved. So, but Mephibosheth lived at Jerusalem and ate regularly at the king's table. Saul's property would not have been in Jerusalem. It would have been at Gibeah of Saul in the territory of Benjamin. Probably not far away, but it wasn't right at Jerusalem. So the produce of the land would have provided for Ziba and his family and his servants, and for Micah, apparently, and anybody else. And apparently David intended this to be the case in perpetuity, that Ziba and his descendants would continue to tend the land for Jonathan's descendants. And we don't know if Jonathan had any other sons. It's possible that he did have other older sons, and they, like their uncles and father, died in that battle with the Philistines. We don't have anything to tell us that. Okay, there's a footnote C there. You can see that it says something about my table as opposed to David's table in the Hebrew. But at any rate, we know from the context that it was in fact the king's table or David's table. Now the story begins to get quite complicated. Sometime after this, King Nahash of the Ammonites died, and his son Hanun became king. Footnote A, after Nahash. As in the parallel text at 1 Chronicles 19:1, Hebrew reads the king. So it was the king of the Ammonites. But we know it was Nahash because he is named earlier in the books of Kings in the story of Saul. Because recall that it was Nahash, king of the Ammonites, at the beginning of Saul's reigns, who had threatened the people of Jabesh Gilead and threatened to remove one eye of all of them and make them subject to him. And they said, can we wait until we send messages to the rest to see if someone's going to come rescue us? And Saul did come and rescue them. Well, now, Saul is Nahash's enemy. And you've heard the saying, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, when David became Saul's enemies in the eyes of the surrounding nations, King Nahash thought, well, here's a guy I can like. And so David and Nahash became friends. So Nahash died, his son Hanun succeeded him as king, and David said, I am going to show loyalty to Hanun, just as his father Nahash was always loyal to me. So David sent ambassadors to express sympathy to Hanun about his father's death. So far, so good. David and Nahash were friends. David finds out that his friend has died. His son is taking his place as king, and David says, well, let's keep this alliance going. Let's keep this friendship going. Nahash was good to me. I want to be good to Nahash's son Hanun. I want there to continue to be a pact of friendship and peace between us. So he sends ambassadors to express sympathy to Hanun about his father's death. But Hanun is young, and he has some younger advisors. Well, let's just read about it. When David's ambassadors arrived in the land of Ammon, remember that the Ammonites are descendants of Lot, the Ammonite commanders said to Hanun, their master, "Do you really think these men are coming here to honor your father? No. David has sent them to spy out the city so they can come in and conquer it." Well, that's typical military thinking. If you're engaged in the business of murder and destruction in order to forward the interests of your own people, as you see it, let's face it, in God's eyes, there's only one human family, so we're all one, or at least we're supposed to be, but people don't think that way. They think in terms of us and them. And these Ammonite commanders had been doing that. They were raised doing that. They're military people, so they're steeped in murder and destruction, particularly in those days. And so when they see something happening, they are just naturally suspicious. There's an old saying that I heard repeated this week. Folks who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. But that is human nature. When we are broken humans and we have these broken coping mechanisms, we are likely to look at other people as relating to life exactly as we relate to life, and that makes us distrustful and suspicious. So the Ammonite commanders don't trust David's ambassadors. They are quite certain in their own minds that they have been sent to spy out the land to make it easier for David to take control. And remember what we just recently read about the people of Moab. Their suspicions are not without foundation. In the previous chapters, we read how David defeated the Moabites, and then he had the people lay down on the ground and measured them off with a length of cord, and two lengths of people were executed, and the third length was allowed to live. With that out there, with people knowing that this has happened, can you blame these commanders for being suspicious of David's intentions and motives when he sends these ambassadors to express sympathy to Hanun regarding his father's death? And so they tell Hanun, I don't think you should believe this. Now, these men had probably been kept in check by Nahash himself, Hanun's father, because he had formed a friendship with David. It doesn't say that they actually met, but they probably did. And Hanun respected David. David respected Hanun. And so Hanun kept his commanders at bay. No, I trust David. You should too. Sit down and shut up. But now they've got a more sympathetic ruler, and they've fed their poison to him, and he buys it. So in verse 4 it says, so Hanun seized David's ambassadors and shaved off half of each man's beard, cut their robes off at the buttocks, and sent them back to David in shame. In other words, they engaged in some Middle East intentional humiliation. You weren't a man if you didn't have a beard, so they shaved off half the beard, and then they cut off their robes so they were partially exposed to further humiliate them, and they sent them back to Israel. When David heard what had happened, he sent messengers to tell them, "Stay at Jericho until your beards grow out, and then come back." In other words, don't show up here humiliated. Wait until you're over what this guy has done to you, and then you can come back. For they felt deep shame because of their appearance. When the people of Ammon realized how seriously they had angered David, they sent and hired 20,000 Aramean foot soldiers from the lands of Beth Rehob and Zobah, 1,000 from the king of Makkah. Now let me look back a little bit, because I'm thinking who the king of Makkah was. I think we know who that was. No, okay, different person. All right, so king of Makkah and 12,000 from the land of Tob. So you add these up, 20,000 and 13,000. You got 33,000 soldiers, or essentially mercenaries, that they've hired from other lands to come help them. Now, I'm wondering about this, because if you're afraid of David, if you don't trust him, why on earth would you try to make him mad? And my guess is Hanun is a new ruler. The commanders have taken advantage of his newness and his inexperience to get him to send away David's ambassadors.
Can I make that?
But I'm wondering if they intended him to humiliate them like he did, or if that was in fact another product of his youth and rashness and inexperience, that he would do this. And so they just wanted him to send the ambassadors away. Instead of just doing that, he went on and humiliated them. And they're, oh, wait a minute, that's not our idea. Now we're in trouble. Now we've got to go get help. What were you going to say?
Well, they said he took the advice of his friends who were younger and less inexperienced. And I'm thinking, how old was this guy? Did he even have a fully developed prefrontal cortex? Was he inbred where he would never have a fully developed prefrontal brain thing up in his head? He was young and dumb.
Well, we don't know how young he was, but he was certainly inexperienced.
Peer pressure, who his friends were also young and dumb. And what teenager out there has any good sense about how to behave in life?
I think you're getting confused with the story of Rehoboam. Rehoboam got different messages from his older advisors and his younger advisors, and he listened to his younger advisors and lost over half the kingdom as a result.
Well, that's what I thought you were talking about.
No, we're talking about Hanun, son of Nahash, king of the Ammonites, who humiliated David's messengers.
I'll be quiet.
Well, I'm just pointing this out, that in this case, there was likely some inexperience going on, and I'm thinking that the commanders did not have in mind what Hanun did to David's ambassadors. Because I think they were smart enough to know you may not like him, you may not trust him, but if you don't trust him, the last thing you want to do is make him mad. And once these men get to Jericho and get the word from David to stay there until the humiliation effects have grown out, then they're we better muscle up here in order to defend ourselves from the wrath of this man that we just made mad. We generated his wrath. Now we've got to figure out how to deal with it. Now, David hears about this too. He's got an intelligence operation. He knows what the people around him are doing. When David heard about this, he sent Joab and all his warriors to fight them. The Ammonite troops came out and drew up their battle lines at the entrance of the city gate, while the Arameans from Zobah and Rehob and the men from Tob and Maacah positioned themselves to fight in the open fields. When Joab saw that he would have to fight on both the front and the rear, he chose some of Israel's elite troops and placed them under his personal command to fight the Arameans, or the Syrians, in the fields. The people ruled over by Damascus, in other words. He left the rest of the army under the command of his brother Abishai, who was to attack the Ammonites. If the Arameans are too strong for me, then come over and help me, Joab told his brother. And if the Ammonites are too strong for you, I will come and help you. Be courageous. Let us fight bravely for our people and the cities of our God. May the Lord's will be done. Well, this is Joab talking using the typical language that people expected to be used in situations like this. Not that he was in any particular way himself dedicated to Yahweh. And notice, they're not really defending their land. They're going out and executing vengeance on David's behalf. When Joab and his troops attacked, the Arameans began to run away. And when the Ammonites saw the Arameans running, they ran from Abishai and retreated into the city. After the battle was over, Joab returned to Jerusalem. So at this point, once Joab had chased the mercenaries that the Ammonites had hired away and had driven the Ammonites back into their capital city, then he left. No need to continue the campaign. He went back to Jerusalem. The Arameans now realized that they were no match for Israel. So when they regrouped, they were joined by additional Aramean troops summoned by Hadadezer from the other side of the Euphrates River. The B will probably tell us that the Hebrew just says the river, but usually that does refer to the Euphrates. These troops arrived at Helam under the command of Shobach, the commander of Hadadezer's forces. And when David heard what was happening, he mobilized all Israel, crossed the Jordan River, and led the army to Helam. The Arameans positioned themselves in battle formation and fought against David. But again, the Arameans fled from the Israelites. This time, David's forces killed 700 charioteers and 40,000 foot soldiers. Now that's as in the Greek manuscripts. See also 1 Chronicles 19:18. The Hebrew reads charioteers. Although I don't know why it'd say 700 charioteers and 40,000 charioteers, but whatever. Maybe it was supposed to be 40,700. including Shobach, the commander of their army. When all the kings allied with Hadadezer saw that they had been defeated by Israel, they surrendered to Israel and became their subjects. After that, the Arameans were afraid to help the Ammonites. Now, so far we've just read about Israel, Ammon, and the Arameans, or the Syrians as we would call them today. But this is going to lead to some very serious complications in David's story. Moving on, 2 Samuel chapter 11. In the spring of the year, we can assume that's the beginning of the next year because the Hebrew year begins with spring, so it'd be right at the first of the year. In the spring of the year, when kings normally go out to war, David sent Joab and the Israelite army to fight the Ammonites. So he's going to now continue what he had dropped off originally when the Arameans fled, and then he continued when the other Arameans and Hadadezer got hired in, and he sent them packing as well, and actually made them subject to him because they realized they weren't as strong as David. They were willing to be subject to him rather than be the objects of his wrath and military prowess. But now it's time to deal with the Ammonites, and David sends Joab and the army out to deal with that. And they're going to the city of Rabbah. Now, I don't know this for certain, but I would guess that the city of Rabbah, the capital of the Ammonites, is at or very close to the modern city of Ammon. Amman is how we usually spell it, but that name is almost certainly derived from the biblical name Ammon, or the Ammonites, and it is in the right territory. Ammon is today the capital of Jordan. So this is roughly the place, I believe, where this battle is going to take place. However, David didn't go this time. He sent Joab the first time. He went himself the second time when dealing with Hadadezer. But now, since it's just the Ammonites and the Arameans are afraid to help the Ammonites, David just sends Joab and he stays behind Jerusalem. And this is going to be David's undoing. Late one afternoon, after his midday rest, or his siesta, if you like that language, David got out of bed and was walking on the roof of the palace. As he looked out over the city, he noticed a woman of unusual beauty taking a bath. He sent someone to find out who she was, and he was told, "She is Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, and the wife of Uriah the Hittite." Now, so far in our reading, we don't have cause to know who Eliam is or who Uriah is. But I'm going to tell you now so that you better understand what's going on in this story. Eliam was one of David's 30 mighty men, or his generals, one of the men in his military. So was Eliam's son-in-law, Uriah the Hittite. Now, Hittite means that Uriah was not native Israelite. He was a descendant of the Hittite people. But he had joined the Israelites, and we can assume that at least in form he worshiped Yahweh, as did the Israelites. And he has married the daughter of Eliam. Now here's the kicker. Eliam's father was someone known as Ahithophel. We'll come across Ahithophel later in David's story. he was an advisor of particularly great skill and intelligence, to the point that people would say that inquiring of Ahithophel was like inquiring of God. So, what's about to happen is going to have an effect on what will happen later in David's history and story. And these people, Bathsheba, Eliam, and Uriah, all are going to be linked into it. So, at this point, at the end of verse 3, when David is told who she is, he knows. He may not have known her personally, but he definitely knows who she is related to, who her father is, who her grandfather is, and who her husband is. Because these people didn't get to places of prominence in David's military structure without David knowing who they were and being familiar with them. It says in verse 4, and certainly a whole lot gets collapsed into a single phrase here. Then David sent messengers to get her, and when she came to the palace, he slept with her. She had just completed the purification rites after having his menstrual period.
I suspect it was rape her.
Well, maybe so, but recall the view of most of the Israelite women about David.
I am recalling that.
So there may have been an element of willingness on Bathsheba's part in what happened. That doesn't make what David did at all right. It doesn't indemnify him in the least. And it doesn't necessarily condemn her. But she may have been a little bit agog. Here's the king. He wants to pay attention to me. Wow. This could be really something. But yeah, what David did was not at all appropriate. And it was probably very close to, if not actually, a rape. Then she returned home. Later, when Bathsheba discovered that she was pregnant, she sent David a message saying, "I'm pregnant." And now David does what is the natural human response when it looks like you might get found out for a mistake. Quick, cover it up. Then David sent word to Joab, that's the leader of his military. He's over at Rabbah, battling the Ammonites. And David sent word, "Send me Uriah the Hittite. Send one of your generals back here to Jerusalem." So Joab sent him to David. When Uriah arrived, David asked him how Joab and the army were getting along and how the war was progressing. So he's giving an excuse, plausible deniability, for why he's called Uriah to Jerusalem. And then he told Uriah, "Go on home and relax." Footnote B, let's see. Wash your feet, an expression that may have had a connotation of ritualistic washing. And we missed footnote A, but that just says what we were saying, that the first day of the year in the ancient Hebrew calendar occurred in March or April. So spring was right at the beginning of the year. So David sends him home. David even sent a gift to Uriah after he had left the palace. But Uriah didn't go home. He slept that night at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. No doubt there were sleeping quarters for the palace guard near the gate, so that they, even if they were asleep, would be available to be woke up if there were an emergency situation. So he just went to those quarters and slept there. When David heard that Uriah had not gone home, well, why does he want him to go home? Well, again, he's trying to cover this up. He wants some plausible deniability. He wants Uriah to be able to think that maybe his wife's child is his own. And so he sends him home, but he didn't go home. And so David then summoned him and asked, "What's the matter? Why didn't you go home last night after being away for so long?" And Uriah replied, "The ark and the armies of Israel and Judah are living in tents, and Joab and my master's men are camping in the open fields. How could I go home to wine and dine and sleep with my wife? I swear that I would never do such a thing." We might consider this kind of a strange version of loyalty. By the way, let's look up that living in tents or at Succoth. Okay, well, I think the intent is also possibly appropriate. The point is that the entire army were not at home, so the rest of the men weren't able to consort with their wives, and out of loyalty to them and perhaps certain cultural conventions of the time, Uriah didn't believe it was appropriate for him to go and enjoy something that the rest of his fellows couldn't while they were out of the country. Are you saying something?
Yeah, I am. He may also have been suspicious over David's sudden interest in him.
Might have been. Yeah, maybe he smelled a rat.
Yeah.
"Well, stay here today," David told him, "and tomorrow you may return to the army." So Uriah stayed in Jerusalem that day and the next. Then David invited him to dinner and got him drunk. So he's trying everything he can think of to get this guy to go home and engage with his wife. But even then he couldn't get Uriah to go home to his wife. Again, he slept at the palace entrance with the king's palace guard. Well, all right. David's had enough of his stubbornness. He sees he's not going to get through without revealing anything. So he comes up with another plan, a more drastic plan. And it gives us a sense of human nature and the lengths that someone, even someone, quote, after God's own heart, will go to when they get caught in this mode of cover-up. So the next morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and gave it to Uriah to deliver. And commentators have noted the irony of this, that David is essentially writing Uriah's death sentence, and he hands it to Uriah to deliver to Uriah's expected executioner. The letter instructed Joab, "Station Uriah on the front lines where the battle is fiercest. Then pull back so that he will be killed." So those are David's orders. We're going to get him killed. We're going to try and make it look like it was a natural event in battle, but the instructions to Joab are, pull back, make sure that he gets killed. So Joab assigned Uriah to a spot close to the city wall where he knew the enemy's strongest men were fighting. And when the enemy soldiers came out of the city to fight, Uriah the Hittite was killed along with several other Israelite soldiers. probably those assigned to him, the unit that he was leading in this attack. And all this was by design. Then Joab sent a battle report to David. He told his messenger, "Report all the news of the battle to the king." But he might get angry and ask, "Why did the troops go so close to the city? Didn't they know they would be shooting from the walls? Wasn't Abimelech, son of Gideon, killed at Thebez by a woman who threw a millstone down from the wall?" Now, it's been several months since we read that story out of the book of Judges, but we did read the story of Abimelech and how that happened. And I mentioned at the time that this would be brought up again, and here it is. He did get killed when a woman threw a millstone down on him from the wall. Now, mind you, a millstone is probably a pretty sizable stone, so if it comes off a city wall several meters high and lands on your head, no, you're probably not going to survive it, and Ahimelech didn't. And then Joab imagines David saying, "Why would you get so close to the wall?" And then he tells his messenger, "Well, then tell him Uriah the Hittite was killed too." Well, the messenger, having listened to this, if we can believe the narrative here, apparently decided he didn't want to hear David be angry. So it says the messenger went to Jerusalem and gave a complete report to David. "The enemy came out against us in the open fields," he said, "and as we chased them back to the city gate, the archers on the wall shot arrows at us. Some of the king's men were killed, including Uriah the Hittite." So he apparently had some inkling from the instructions Joab would give him that David would want to know this, and that knowing this would serve to placate David's wrath. So he gets it out right away so David will know it. And it seems to work, because then David says, "Well, tell Joab not to be discouraged," David said. "The sword devours this one today and that one tomorrow. Fight harder next time and conquer the city." When Uriah's wife, that's Bathsheba, heard that her husband was dead, she mourned for him. When the period of mourning was over, David sent for her and brought her to the palace, and she became one of his wives. Then she gave birth to a son, but the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Well, we sometimes question the reports of the Hebrew writers about God's motives and how he feels. But I don't think we have to question this one. Would a God of love be displeased with what David had done? Well, of course he would be. So, while some of what follows we might question, we're not going to question this. Yeah, Yahweh was displeased with what David had done. Yeah, they did have a footnote there we didn't mention, but that's the Hebrew says son of Mephibosheth, which is a variant of Jerubbaal, which, as we know, was another name given to Gideon because of how he destroyed the altar to Baal that his father had built. And then his father defended him, saying, "Well, let Baal contend for himself," leading to this term used for Gideon, Jerubbaal. Chapter 12. So the Lord sent Nathan the prophet to tell David this story. And here's another parable. This is a story that's not necessarily true, but the prophet is going to use it in order to bring David to an understanding of God's view of what he had done. So, Nathan the prophet comes to David. Recall, we've already encountered this Nathan because David had told Nathan he wanted to build a temple, and Nathan says, go ahead. And then the next day he'd come in and say, well, God talked to me last night. You're not the one to do it. Your son will do it. So he tells this story. Here's the story. There were two men in a certain town. One was rich and one was poor. The rich man owned a great many sheep and cattle. The poor man owned nothing but one little lamb he had bought. He raised that little lamb, and it grew up with his children. It ate from the man's own plate and drank from his cup. He cuddled it in his arms like a baby daughter. So, in this story, the man takes this lamb essentially as a pet. It's not livestock anymore, it's a household pet. It eats at his table, and he gives it special attention. One day, a guest arrived at the home of the rich man. But instead of killing an animal from his own flock or herd, he took the poor man's lamb and killed it and prepared it for his guest. Now, this is a carefully crafted story, and Nathan has put it together in such a way as to really get David stirred up. He portrays a blatant injustice. He portrays a man who has everything and doesn't need anything, stealing from a poor man who has almost nothing, just so that he doesn't have to expend his own resources. Toxic in the extreme. I mean, the very definition of entitled and selfish and just arrogant and all the negative things you can use to describe a man. This is the man that Nathan portrays in this story. And as expected, David was furious. As surely as the Lord lives, he vowed, any man who would do such a thing deserves to die. In David's mind, he's issuing a death sentence. He's not going to issue an actual death sentence, but he is going to issue this sentence. He must repay 4 lambs to the poor man for the one he stole and for having no pity. So he ought to die, but I'm not going to order him to die, but here's what he ought to do. He ought to pay back what he stole, and he ought to pay it back 4-fold. Then Nathan said to David, you are that man. Or as it says in the King James, you are the man. How? Well, how many wives did David have? We don't know. We know 6 of them are named. And then there are others. So who knows how many? He had plenty of wives. He didn't really need another one. He had more than he could hope to satisfy already. And yet he takes another man's wife. And while Uriah may not have been particularly poor, I mean, he was David's general, one of David's generals, I should say.
He may not have been particularly interested in his wife either.
Who knows? But I'm guessing he probably only had the one wife. But it didn't matter because David had him killed over his wife and over his loyalty to his fellow army soldiers, refusing to go home to his wife when they couldn't. You are that man. The Lord, the God of Israel, says, I anointed you king of Israel and saved you from the power of Saul. I gave you your master's house and his wives and the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. And if that had not been enough, I would have given you much, much more. Why then have you despised the word of the Lord and done this horrible deed? For you have murdered Uriah the Hittite with the sword of the Ammonites and stolen his wife. From this time on, your family will live by the sword, because you have despised me, that is Yahweh, by taking Uriah's wife to be your own. Now, God doesn't have to do anything for the sentence that Nathan declares here to take place. As we read through the successive story, we're going to see how what happened is the natural and more or less inevitable result of David's misdeed here. From this time on, your family, your own sons, will live by the sword because you did this. This is what Yahweh says. Because of what you have done, I will cause your own household to rebel against you. We know about that story. I will give your wives to another man before your very eyes, and he will go to bed with them in public view. We'll read how that happens. You did it secretly, but I will make this happen to you openly in the sight of all Israel. Then we read on. Then David confessed to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. Nathan replied, yes, but Yahweh has forgiven you, and you won't die for this sin. Nevertheless, because you have shown utter contempt for the word of Yahweh, or the Lord, by doing this, your child will die. There's a footnote there right after Yahweh. Let's see. As in the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Masoretic text, or as in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Masoretic text reads, the enemies of the Lord. And I don't know, I think that may come out in the King James. Let's see, we're in 2 Samuel 12. And I want to see how it words that, because it sticks in the back of my head that it may actually say that way in the King James. Yeah, verse 14, here it is in the King James. Howbeit, because by this deed thou hast given great occasion to the enemies of the Lord to blaspheme, the child also that is born unto thee shall surely die. And I think the NIV also retains wording that's like that. Let's see. But because by doing this you have made the enemies of the Lord show utter contempt, the son born to you will die.
Look at natural cause and effect.
All right.
That could have affected the child. I'm not medically trained, so I wouldn't know. But could something have happened to cause the pregnancy to be a high-risk pregnancy, which could have led to a birth defect? Maybe it was something she ate. Maybe it was that the blood types didn't match. I don't know.
Here's what I think may be possible. Consider the emotional state of the mother during the pregnancy.
That too. I was thinking that too.
Yeah. She would have been grieving, depressed, and maybe even worse, emotional state. And that, I think, almost certainly would have had an effect on the fetus.
Well, she knew that her husband, that she was a widow now because of her own actions.
Yeah, so there might have been some self-recrimination going on as well.
If she had been willing. And if she had been raped, it just, I would think that would be even worse. And here she was single and expecting.
Yeah.
And she hadn't been with her husband.
Okay. So, that's verse 14. The child would die, Nathan reported. After Nathan returned to his home, the Lord, Hebrew viewpoint, sent a deadly illness to the child of David and Uriah's wife. David begged God to spare the child. He went without food and lay all night on the bare ground. The elders of his household pleaded with him to get up and eat with them, but he refused. Then, on the 7th day, the child died. David's advisors were afraid to tell him. He wouldn't listen to reason while the child was ill, they said. What drastic thing will he do when we tell him the child is dead? Suggesting to us they didn't understand David and his mindset. David's done something pretty negative here. But he is not, like his predecessor Saul, slipping into mental instability. But his advisors don't know this. They haven't figured that out yet. And they see what condition he's in when the child is sick. And they're trying to get him to eat, and he won't. And they're like, has this guy gone off his rocker? Are we losing the king already? And now the child dies, and they're like, OMG. What'll happen if we tell him this? When David saw them whispering, he realized what had happened. Is the child dead? He asked. Well, they couldn't hide it anymore. They had a direct question they had to answer. Yes, they replied, he is dead. Then David got up from the ground, washed himself, put on lotions, footnote B there for lotions, anointed himself, and where was I? Changed his clothes. He went to the tabernacle and worshipped the Lord. After that, he returned to the palace and was served food and ate. His advisors were amazed. Well, I don't understand you, they told him. While the child was still living, you wept and refused to eat. But now that the child is dead, you've stopped your mourning and are eating again. David replied, I fasted and wept while the child was alive, for I said, perhaps the Lord will be gracious to me and let the child live. But why should I fast when he is dead? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him one day, but he cannot return to me. Then David comforted Bathsheba, now his wife, and slept with her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son, and David named him Solomon. Footnote there, see he, an alternative Hebrew reading, and some Hebrew manuscripts read she. So the name Solomon may have come from Bathsheba, not necessarily from David. That's his name. That's all we really need to know. The Lord loved the child and sent word through Nathan the prophet that they should name him Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, as the Lord had commanded. That makes me recall something. Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. Different languages have a similar name. So in the German, you have Gottlieb. Liebe is the German word for love. Gott, G-O-T-T, is their word for God. So Gottlieb is essentially loved by God, or the one God loves. Years and years ago, there was a young man named Wolfgang Gottlieb Mozart. Being brought up in the tradition of the time, where the language of the church was Latin, he decided that he wanted to use the Latin term for his middle name. And so instead of being called Wolfgang Gottlieb Mozart, he became Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. More recently, a musician named Harold Gottlieb Miller found that out about Mozart and decided to do the same with his own middle name. And so he changed his name from Harold Gottlieb Miller to Harold Amadeus Miller. And if you have an Adventist hymnal, you will be able to look it up and find out that Harold A. Miller did in fact write the music to some of the hymns in the Adventist hymnal, particularly the 1940 hymnal. The tunes he wrote are really quite sophisticated and interesting. But at any rate, that's the story. So this name Jedediah has survived in different forms in different languages from that period on. And so Solomon is also known as Jedediah. Meanwhile, and this certainly goes back in time to tell this part of the story, Joab was fighting against Rabbah, the capital of Ammon, and he captured the royal fortifications. Footnote E, the royal city. All right. Joab sent messengers to tell David, I have fought against Rabbah and captured its water supply. Yeah?
Outside.
Oh, is there? All right, let me pause this for a moment. We'll be back. You'll see us back right away. But we got that taken care of. A next door neighbor wanted to get permission, more or less, to trim some limbs on a tree that overhang his property. He was very nice about it, so we had a little conversation. So we're going to be a little bit late here. And we had scrolled down and we need to go back up. So we just read about Jedediah. No, we're reading here about Joab sending the message to tell David that he fought against Rabbah and captured its water supply. We were going down to here and captured the city of water, whatever. Now bring the rest of the army and capture the city. Otherwise, I will capture it and get credit for the victory. So David gathered the rest of the army and went to Rabbah, and he fought against it and captured it. David removed the crown from the king's head, from the head of Milcom, as in the Greek version. Milcom, also called Molech, was the god of the Ammonites. So it may not have been the king's crown, but the crown of their god. And it was placed on his own head. The crown was made of gold and set with gems, and it weighed 75 pounds. You going to wear that on your head? Yeah, 1 talent, or about 34 kilograms. But still, that's a lot of weight to carry around. It's going to make for a sore neck. David took a vast amount of plunder from the city. He also made slaves of the people of Rabbah and forced them to labor with saws, iron picks, and iron axes, and to work in the brick kilns. That is how he dealt with the people of all the Ammonite towns. Then David and all the army returned to Jerusalem. So now we've turned them into slaves and forced labor. And there's a few final footnotes there. He also brought out the people of Rabbah and put them under, or Hebrew, and he made them pass through the big kilns. Wonder how the King James translates that. The King James, says exactly that. And he brought forth the people that were therein and put them under saws and under harrows of iron and under axes of iron, and made them pass through the big brick kiln. And thus did he unto all the cities of the children of Ammon. So David and all the people of Jerusalem returned to Jerusalem. And so that's the end of the war between Israel and Ammon. And David adds not only Moab, but Ammon and all to his territory that reached potentially as far as the Euphrates River and the traditional north and south boundaries, an extended territory that's much larger than even modern Israel. And I see from my timer here that we're a little bit over again, so we're going to stop here. We finished chapter 12. So 9, 10, 11, 12, that's 4 chapters. And we will continue the story of David next week as we continue on our Friday night Bible studies. We thank you for joining us. We certainly hope you'll join us again next week. We invite you to. And until then, we say goodbye and God bless.